It's now my pleasure to introduce David Cropley, Associate Professor in Engineering Innovation at the University of South Australia. Dr. Cropley joined the School of Engineering at the South Australian Institute of Technology in 1990, as it was then known, after serving for 4 years in the UK's Royal Navy, including deployments in the Middle East and West Indies. Now a recognised expert in creative problem solving and innovation, David was a scientific consultant and on-screen expert for the Australian ABC TV documentary Redesign My Brain, Life at 9 and Redesign My Brain Series 2. Very effective. I think we all ended up doing things on our apps, David, so you're probably responsible for that. Can I introduce David to you and ask him to come to the lectern, please?
So the last speech I actually gave over a meal was a few months ago at the Adelaide Rowing Club at their annual dinner, and I made somebody cry. So I'll try not to do that today. So I'd like to talk to you about the idea of innovation alchemy and in fact turning ideas into gold as a sort of metaphor for innovation in the resources sector. Now, a traditional assumption in economics is that we live in a resource-limited world, and what this means is that wealth is a function of the supply of physical resources. Under this assumption, the world operates as a zero-sum game. So, finite resources means finite wealth, and for every winner, there must be a loser. A consequence of this can be a mindset that is focused on maintaining the status quo and preserving the value of those finite resources. And this is a mindset that sees the world in terms of old solutions and old problems. This is also a mindset that is hostile to innovation. And because innovation means change, and change risks disrupting the value of our slice of that finite pie. You can see I've got a few slide transitions here, so I'm going to be dodging back and forth. Throughout much of history, and certainly in medieval Europe, alchemists sought to defy this concept of a zero-sum game, a world of finite resources. They sought to do that by transforming base metals into gold. They sought to create wealth not by obtaining a slice of a finite resource pie, but by creating value where little or none existed, creating a new or bigger pie, in other words. And we now know that the medieval alchemists, of course, failed in this quest, and indeed the term alchemy has become synonymous with pseudoscience. However, in the modern world, we see a very real example of alchemy at work, and it relates directly to the question of wealth and the supply of physical resources. Indeed, it redefines the whole concept of an economic zero-sum game and places technological innovation at the centre of wealth, productivity, and prosperity. Now, to understand the central role of technological innovation in creating wealth, consider a key resource. Let's take oil as an example. At the time of the first major oil crisis, which many of us will remember, estimates placed the global reserve of crude oil at about 700 billion barrels. And it was estimated that this was sufficient to last for about 40 years, in other words, until about 2013, and of course we know that didn't happen. Furthermore, subsequent estimates in 1987, for example, put the global reserve of oil at 900 billion barrels. In other words, more than existed in 1973. So how was this possible? Did the Earth spontaneously refill with oil, or was there some other explanation? The answer, of course, is that technological innovation made the resources pie, in effect, bigger. And it did this in two ways, and it continues to do it in two ways for all sorts of resources, whether people, minerals, oil and gas, land, and so on. Firstly, technological innovation, either in the form of incremental improvements or paradigm-shifting inventions, redefined what is a physical resource. For example, in 1973, oil companies could only reach a depth, and I know there are people in the room who probably know the real answer, so I'm giving you a kind of representative number. Oil companies could only reach oil to a depth of, let's say, 1,000 meters. And there's an example of the kind of progression of that in drilling offshore. Now, what that meant was that any oil that was deeper than 1,000 meters was, for all practical purposes, not a resource at all, because it was inaccessible. By 1987, however, oil companies had both improved their existing technology and developed new technologies that, among other things, allowed them to reach that previously inaccessible oil. And that turned the inaccessible oil into a usable resource and made the oil resource pie bigger. Secondly, technological innovation found ways to make the existing supply of oil go further. Replacing $300 carburetors, for example, with less expensive and more efficient computerized fuel injectors doubled the fuel efficiency of cars. And of course, less fuel used for an existing purpose means that the pie, again, in effect, becomes bigger. In fact, the role of technology was to change that equation I showed you before, that wealth is a function of physical resources, into a slightly more sophisticated equation, which I'll explain in a moment, that wealth is equal to physical resources multiplied by something else. Now, returning to the concept of alchemy and that equation, we can now say that innovation alchemy, or quite simply technological innovation, controls both the definition and the supply of physical resources. So the term T to the N, that represents technology, determines what is a physical resource, and it also therefore determines the size of the economic pie that we have access to. We create wealth where little wealth existed through the disproportionate effect of technological innovation, and it's that term N that's the critical one here. In other words, the effect of new and improved technological products, processes, systems and services that turn resources into wealth. So it's the size of N, therefore, that's critical and represents our capacity to innovate. The bigger the N is, the better our ability to come up with technological innovations. Now, to illustrate this point, consider the following curves. And in this particular example, as you can see, wealth is on the vertical axis, technology is on the horizontal axis, and I'm holding P, the physical resources, constant. And then we can see that the impact of T to the N, or technology, on wealth and prosperity is quite significant, or can be quite significant. But it's only when N is greater than 1 does technology deliver a disproportionate effect on growth. More importantly, if N is less than 1, the blue curve, then we see no growth at all, stagnation in other words. We can think of this as attempting to solve new problems with old technology. For example, the solution to the problem of carbon emissions is not to burn more coal. When N is equal to 1, the red curve, then we can think of this as replication. So existing technology is applied to existing problems. And that's not bad, but growth is slowly incremental. And it's only when N is greater than 1, the green curve, that we begin to move from incremental growth to exponential growth, as you can see. And as N becomes greater than 1, we can characterize this as redirection and reinitiation. In other words, new paradigm-shifting solutions to the new problems that we face. Now, in South Australia, I think we're in a very lucky position. We have at our disposal a wide range of resources, some of which we do a very good job of transforming into wealth, according to that equation. Our challenge then, if we wish to prosper, is to make better use of the T, the technology in particular, because of the potential multiplier effect that technological innovation can exert on wealth. So our focus must be on that term T to the N. And T to the N offers a means for a bigger bang for our buck. However, this will require us to reorientate our thinking, placing a far greater emphasis on innovation, and especially on how individuals and organisations generate and then exploit novel and effective technological solutions. Despite the fact that creativity, the generation of novelty, and innovation, the exploitation of that novelty, continue to be dogged by a reputation of mystery and inaccessibility, the fact is we know a great deal about what enables people gathered together in organisations to innovate. And we need to make better use of that knowledge of the psychology of creativity and innovation. This is both a skills issue for the sector as well as an organisational issue. And to make better use of T to the N, we need people equipped with the right skills and abilities operating in the right environments. So I'd like to give you a very brief overview of what we do know about creating high-performing, innovative people and organisations. 4 parameters, as you can see on this slide, determine creativity and innovation. And these interact as a system to deliver innovative outcomes. When the right qualities of individual people, motivation, risk-taking, openness, for example, combined with favourable cognitive processes, so thinking tools, divergent thinking, for example, and when these take place within a supportive organisational culture, or press, as we call it in the psychology of creativity, then we see the successful development of innovative products or outcomes and outputs, be they tangible artifacts or intangible processes or services or even complex systems. My own research focuses on the measurement and development of these four parameters across all stages of innovation and is concerned with helping organisations to measure their capacity for innovation. In other words, their strengths and weaknesses across these parameters, so that we can then devise and implement strategies to ensure that their T to the M, and therefore their wealth, prosperity and productivity is maximised. So to conclude, I'd like to reiterate that the key to prosperity is the alchemy of technology that transforms raw resources into valuable resources, be they oil and gas, minerals, arable land or people. This is the 21st century equivalent of turning base metals into gold. And we are well endowed with these resources so that our focus for economic prosperity must be on strengthening our capacity for technological innovation. To do that, we can draw on the body of knowledge, the psychology of organisational innovation, that links people employing the right processes in the right environment to deliver innovative outcomes. And the fact is that we have the means to measure our capacity for organisational innovation, and adapting the words of Lord Kelvin, we can measure it so we can improve it. I think there's time for questions a bit later on, so thank you very much for your time, and I'll field some questions later on. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, David, and you're right. If you can sort of remember the questions you might have for each of the speakers, we'll have them back up and have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations.